Welcome to Module 4, Study Startup. In this module, we're going to discuss study startup activities. Once again, we're going to have two short lectures. In Part 1, this lecture, we'll discuss study startup, timelines, and budget. In Part 2, we're going to discuss database creation, testing, and the data entry instructions. Again, in this module, we're going to focus on study startup activities. We'll discuss how to prepare the CDM team for study startup. This includes outlining roles and responsibilities, training the team on the project, communicating timelines, identifying deliverables, and understanding budget issues. In Part 2, again, we'll be focusing on database testing and the data entry instructions. For a project to be successful, the roles and responsibilities of each team member must be clearly defined, and each task has to have an owner who's responsible for ensuring that task is completed and that it's completed on time. First and foremost, if more than one organization is working on the project, such as a sponsor contracting to a CRO or a site, it needs to be clear which organization is responsible for each task. Proxtica includes a really nice example of a responsibility matrix in Appendix C. Use this as a reference when working on your group assignment. Within the project team, you typically find a project manager, a CDM team lead who directs the work of CDM team members. If the project's large, there may also be task leads who direct work on specific tasks, such as QC or the SAE-AE reconciliation. Most projects also have several team members who work on the project under the direction of the CDM lead. In many organizations, CDM activities are supported by database programmers. These are programmers who tend to do much of their programming using SQL. SQL, or SQL, is commonly used with relational databases, and almost all of the commercial clinical data management systems are running off of relational databases. Many projects will also have additional programmers from the biostatistics department. These programmers usually work with the data after it has been exported out of the database and into SAS datasets. SAS stands for Statistical Analysis Software. Most analyses in our industry are conducted using SAS. In fact, you'll often hear these programmers referred to as SAS programmers or statistical programmers. At some point, the data is going to be needed to be coded. And again, coding refers to assigning a numeric code to the adverse event, disease, or concomitant medication text. That allows the text to be converted to an analyzable format. Sometimes the coders are going to be part of data management. Sometimes they are their own standalone group, or they may be part of the safety group that handles reporting of SAEs. Wherever the coders are located on the organizational chart, at some point the project team is going to be interacting with them to get the data coded. To give you some ideas about how you define responsibilities, I've listed some of the responsibilities that you would need to think about when setting up weekly data transfers to the sponsor. For example, who sets up the specifications for the transfers? Who's going to be responsible for actually seeing they happen? Who's going to be responsible for making sure they can be used when they're received? These are the types of things you want to think about. As a functional supervisor in data management, I've always placed great importance on training the CDM team. Most organizations are going to support training on the project-specific instructions and the documents, but I think it's equally important that team members have a sense of the client-sponsor relationship and the importance of this protocol or investigational product for the client. Is this product going to be part of a novel or new class of drug? Is it going to be a blockbuster? Is it the only trial that a small biotech is running? Will this trial be one of the 2 pivotal trials for approval? Or is this an older, already approved product and it's simply being tested against a competitor for marketing data? All of these issues are going to influence the expectations for the project and the dynamic of the project team. It's also important for the team members to know what the budget is for each task they're going to perform. This defines the metrics for the project and helps team members know when the time for or the volume of a task is going to exceed the budget. Team members also need to understand the full timeline for the project. If you don't know the date listings are going to be sent to the Drug Safety Monitoring Board, or DSMB, you can't establish timelines for preparing the data for those listings. Now, not all organizations are going to agree that team members need this background information. You might find yourself working in an organization that thinks data management should be done heads down. In that case, I suggest you try to educate yourself on these issues. Ask the project manager for the background on the client or study. Read up on the indication or review the protocol on your own. You'll be a better team member, you're going to enjoy your work more, and it'll help you in professional development if you learn about the big picture. And of course, remember, document all the training the team has received. Just a quick reminder that all the project instructions and documents have to be in place before beginning the activity they document. In other words, don't enter the data without the entry instructions, don't review the data without the data review plan. And if there are specific signatures or approvals required by the SOP or contract, make sure those are taken care of as well. And make sure that you have version control. Everybody should be using the correct version. Finally, document all that training. Where do timelines come from? Does the project manager pull them out of the air? Who provides input into timelines? Well, the team should develop the initial timeline by looking at the contract, scope of work, and protocol to see what tasks need to be done and when they need to occur. So identify specific deliverables such as the monthly listings or an interim analysis conducted when a certain percentage of patients is enrolled, or look for quarterly DSMB data transfers. Then, get input from appropriate team members before setting any internal timelines. Do not set a database creation timeline of 1 week unless you ensure the database programming group has the resources to do that. Always, always communicate problems or potential problems. Don't hide them. Don't hope they'll go away if you ignore them. If you find yourself in danger of not meeting a timeline, it's better to let your team know as soon as possible so they can try to find a solution. I thought you might like to see an example of a data management project timeline. I mocked one up using real and imagined events from the development of the CLR Mock 001 database project. Notice the timeline begins with the finalization of the protocol in CRF, and it ends with a locked database and the final analysis of 100% of the patients. Let's touch on deliverables again. Remember that you're going to review the contract, scope of work, and protocol to ensure you understand what the deliverables are, who's responsible for them, and where they fall in the project timeline. Keep in mind your deliverables can be internal or external. Internal deliverables can transfer a task or data from one department to another within the same organization. External deliverables are going to transfer a task or data to an outside vendor or sponsor. Don't assume that internal timelines aren't important. They may be the key to an external deliverable. For example, data management might have a timeline or deadline for completing QC on all data for the interim analysis and delivering or releasing that data to biostatistics. If data management misses their internal deliverable, that might mean that biostats misses their external deliverable, which is sending the interim analysis to the client. Where does the budget come from? Well, the sponsor develops an overall budget for the drug development portion of a trial by looking at what their expected revenue is and what they really can spend in development. Then they take that overall budget and they break it down for individual protocols and projects. If they're going to run the project in-house and on their own, that's the budget that comes to their staff and what they need to meet. If the sponsor decides to contract that work out for the protocol, then you have another round of negotiations where the sponsor sends out a request for proposal and essentially says what they want done in the study, and different CROs and vendors respond with an estimate of how many hours they would need to do that work and what they would charge for it. And this kind of goes back and forth until the sponsor and the vendor have reached an agreement on the task to be done and the amount of money that's going to be charged for doing them. So once that contract is in place, then the team really needs to either meet the budget or it has to demonstrate a compelling reason to negotiate for more hours or dollars. Well, what would be a compelling reason? We're going to talk a little bit about assumptions. Every project has a set of assumptions, and they essentially say, this is what I think the project's going to be like. Generally they deal, we'll talk more about them in the next couple of slides, but generally assumptions deal with how complex or difficult the trial is going to be. So, if you have a change in the project metrics or the project assumptions, then you might have a compelling reason to ask the sponsor to renegotiate the budget with you. Here's a couple of examples of what might constitute compelling changes. Let's say that you assumed the complexity of the study would be, pretty simple, not too challenging. The patients aren't very sick, so you think that you'll be able to resolve 6 data queries or discrepancies in an hour. So essentially that it would take you about 15 minutes to resolve one. Instead, once you get into the study, you find it's taking you an hour just to resolve 3 queries. And you've realized that something needs to change or you're going to go significantly over budget. You either need to get more time to handle all those queries, or you need to find a way to do the queries faster, or you need to find a way to reduce the number of queries. So all of those things would be a change in the assumptions. You assumed you would have data that was not too complex and that you could resolve 6 queries in an hour, and now you're finding that you can actually only get through 3 queries in an hour. Here's another example. Let's say you assumed there would only be 300 patients that enrolled in the study, but partway through the sponsor decides they want to extend enrollment, and they're going to allow an additional 100 patients to participate in the study. Well, that's a very compelling reason to come back to the sponsor and say, we need to renegotiate the contract and account for the extra hours that are going to be required to process those 100 patients. So, budgets and assumptions. I wanted to show you some pretty common or standard assumptions that you'll see in most contracts. People are going to want to know the number of patients you expect to screen, and remember, screening is when you meet a patient and just try to figure out if they're even eligible for the study. And then the number of patients who actually are eligible and that you consent and they enroll. The number of unique CRFs, and by this we mean the number of forms that you are going to build a data entry screen for. The total number of CRFs, and that is, let's say you have 15 unique CRFs and 100 patients, you would expect a total of 1,050 case report forms. So total number of CRFs is what you expect to get for all the patients. Non-CRF data to be reconciled. Are you going to have a lot of lab data coming in or IVRS data? Number of serious adverse events, and the number of adverse events. The number of queries per patient, and the number of edit checks you expect to program, the number of monthly and or status reports and how many months you have to send them for, the number of times you need to transfer the database, the duration of the patient screening and enrollment period, because regardless of how many patients you screen and enroll, if you screen 1,000 patients in 1 month or 1,000 patients in 4 months, you're going to have monthly activities that take up additional time for those extra 3 months. The duration of study activities, the same thing. The longer the study is, the more monthly activities that you have to account for. And are you doing things like DSMB? Remember, that's Drug Safety Monitoring Board listings or tables or data sets that you need to account for. Once you know what your budget is, you need to start monitoring it. How do you monitor a budget? First, you make sure, again, you know what tasks are included in the budget and the number of hours estimated for completing them. For projects that are being handled internally, you might not have a contract, but there will still be a set of department metrics that tell you an average of 45 seconds is required to enter a page of data. There might also be indication or project-specific metrics that tell you that for complicated indications like oncology, you might need 60 seconds per page. On the other hand, if you're working as a vendor or CRO, you will definitely have a contract, and your contract will allow you to figure out what metrics are required to meet the budget. You need to be on the lookout as you work on projects for changes in the metrics or your assumptions that are indicators you're going over budget. If you spot this early, it's possible to respond by either negotiating an upcharge, modifying your process, or modifying the deliverables. So let's talk about an upcharge or change order. Essentially, this is where you tell the client that you think there has been a change in your assumptions, and based on that you want to negotiate a change to the budget, and typically you are charging them more for it, so it's referred to as an upcharge. Or you may need to take a look at your process and determine if your process is the reason you're going over budget. For example, could you be generating queries on non-critical data? If so, can you stop generating those queries and bring your metric back in line? Or do you need to review your process and figure other ways that you might be going over budget? Perhaps you need to work with the CRAs to train the sites on ways they can reduce the amount of discrepant data they're entering. So here you are looking at modifying your process as opposed to simply preparing to charge the client more. Perhaps, though, the problem is the number of ad hoc or unbudgeted listings or tasks the client's asking for. The client may not even be aware that what they think of as one-off requests are pushing you over budget. In this case, a project manager may need to explain to the client that they have to restrict the number of ad hoc requests or deliverables they are looking for, or modify the contract to pay for those additional requests. I want to talk very briefly about the relationship between budgeted or estimated hours and the timeline, which consists of calendar days or weeks. In general, we think of a full-time employee as someone who works 40 hours per week. You'll also hear this referred to as an FTE, or full-time equivalent. So we can think of calendar work as being comprised of 5 8-hour days, and again equal to 40 hours. So if you have a task that's budgeted at 200 hours, you can estimate how much time and or how many FTEs will be needed to complete that task. Let's take a look at two different examples of how to calculate the calendar days required for a 200-hour task. In the first one, example 1, you could have 5 people working 40 hours a week and get the job done in 1 week. Or in example 2, you could take one person working 40 hours a week, but you're going to need 5 calendar weeks to get the same job done. Now that we've talked about assumptions, budgets, and timelines, let's take a look at what happens if one or more of these factors changes. Remember that we started with a general set of assumptions that we use to define the budget and timeline. But as studies progress, we often find our assumptions were wrong, or that we're being asked to do additional work. This is called scope creep. Here are 2 examples. In the first, example 1, we assumed there were 15 unique CRFs, and that we would create 15 unique entry screens, and it would take us 10 hours per screen. This would mean we'd spend 150 hours creating the CRFs and be paid $120 for each of those hours. So our total budget for creating the data entry screens would be $18,000. What happens if the client decides to add an additional 5 case report forms? Well, if we don't adjust the budget, we're now doing $24,000 worth of work, but we're only getting paid $18,000, so we're losing $6,000. Now look at example 2. Here we assume that we would create 50 edit checks, and that it would take 2 hours to create each edit check, which meant we'd spend 100 hours doing the work and be paid $12,000. But what happens if we find out the data is more complex than we expected, and the client wants us to program an additional 50 edit checks? Well, now we're doing $24,000 worth of work, but only being paid $12,000 for it. In other words, between the additional 5 CRFs and the 50 additional edit checks, we've lost $18,000. So you can see why you want to keep track of minor changes to your assumptions and communicate them to the project manager, because otherwise you can result in a lot of scope creep and your budget will be shot. Okay, so for Module 4, you guys have another group assignment, and I wanted to remind you to not wait till the last minute to listen to the lectures and do the reading, because you cannot complete the assignment until you have listened to the lectures and done the reading. So one of the first things I would do, it's a 2-week module. In your first week, listen to Lecture 1. I have a couple of videos I want you to watch. Read an article on data management and clinical research, and read PROSCA Chapter 5. And then I recommend you use that first week to set dates for your group assignment, which again is going to be due on September 24th. Also, you need to log in and set up your REDCap user account so that we can use it in the next module. I'll expect you to have done that and reported any issues to me by September 24th. For Part 2, the second week, I would listen to the Part 2 lecture. I'd read Verifying and Validating Clinical Data Management Software and PROSCA Chapter 6, Receiving Data on Paper. Your group assignment, what I'm going to want you guys to do is mock up a miniature little data management plan where you come up with at least 5 elements that should be in the plan. And then also create a little miniature timeline, and that should have at least 10 elements, and those should be linked back and forth. So in other words, if you say you're going to do a task in the data management plan, you need to account for it in the timeline, and vice versa. All right, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm always happy to help.